Lebanon has the highest concentration of refugees in the world. Syrian and Palestinian refugees account for almost a third of the country's population by some estimates. It's an enormous strain on Lebanon's economy and infrastructure. And for the refugees, it's a miserable and sometimes dangerous existence. Arwa Damon is a senior international correspondent for CNN who has spent years covering conflict in the region. She is also the founder of a Beirut-based charity called Inara, which helps provide medical assistance to refugee children from Syria. Arwa Damon spoke to us from Istanbul, Turkey. Arwa, you've spent many years not only covering wars, but the fallout from those wars and the people affected by them. How would you describe the situation for Syrian refugees in Lebanon now?
I think it's a situation that really grows more difficult by the day, given certain realities that they are having to deal with on the ground, starting with the fact that the Lebanese government, the country in and of itself, is completely and totally overwhelmed with the volume of refugees that are coming in. There is not enough international assistance, despite the number of aid groups that are on the ground that are really doing whatever it is that they can. But it's very difficult, especially within Lebanon, when you compare it to other countries that are also trying to deal with the influx of Syrian refugees, because there are no formal camps that have been established in Lebanon. So the refugees end up either in these makeshift camps or trying to live in these various different decrepit apartments or buildings that have not been entirely established. They're dealing with all sorts of illnesses and injuries that are byproducts of the fact that they're there living as refugees. Access to an education is, of course, phenomenally difficult. And then you have these growing tensions between the Lebanese population and the Syrian refugee population, because the country is not capable of absorbing the volume of refugees that exist there and being able to provide all of them with jobs. And the thing is a lot of these people are not actually going to be able to go back home, either because their homes have been entirely destroyed or because they're afraid of going back. And I think one of the big problems, not just for Lebanon, but for all countries that have been trying to deal with this Syrian refugee crisis, is a lot of the planning has been short term. Whereas the sad reality is that the planning really needs to become long term and sustainable.
Is it becoming a political issue in Lebanon? You talk about that tension?
I think it does, to a certain degree, become politicized. I mean, Syria becomes politicized, especially when it comes to Lebanon. Syria has always been very divisive when it comes to the various different political parties and entities that exist in Lebanon. I think there's a certain level of empathy, to put it that way, because the Lebanese do know what it's like to have to flee war. But at the same time, there's the reality that Lebanon in and of itself is struggling economically. It's struggling politically. It always has. It's always been sort of on the edge, on the verge of complete and total chaos, somehow miraculously holding itself together. And then, of course, you throw in all of the refugees that are there right now. I mean, invariably, it does play into the politics. But at the end of the day, realistically speaking, what can the country actually do to cope with this situation without sustainable outside assistance? And again, as I was saying before, a long-term strategy.
You've founded a charity to help some of the children, particularly, who've been most profoundly affected by the war in Syria and have found themselves in that situation in Lebanon. Tell me what gap your organization is trying to fill.
So what we aim to do, which is absolutely not to compete with anyone else who is working there, is to pinpoint the cases amongst the child refugee population of injuries that have either been caused while they were in Syria or injuries that are brought about because of the circumstances they're having to live in Lebanon, and try to connect them to the medical assistance they need, and then, of course, provide the funds necessary for them to receive the kind of medical treatment that they would be required. We also provide every child with a caseworker. The families, and this is actually something that has proven to be quite critical, are very reassured by the knowledge that they have a phone number that they can call and there is someone on the other end who's going to answer, because a lot of the organizations that are there are completely and totally overwhelmed. There are circumstances that these kids are confronting within their own country, the psychological trauma, the injuries that they're sustaining there that then require secondary surgeries that would allow them to go back to school. For example, a child who has been burnt across the chest, who can't lift their arms, requires burn scar revision surgery. That's a lot of what we do. And then they can lift their arms and they can go to school and they don't feel mocked anymore, to the even more severe cases of a young woman whose jaw was blown off and did, yes, initially get treatment. But the treatment that she received was to pull a flap of skin over her mouth. And she was a vibrant, amazing teenager, but was ashamed to go outside. And we were able to provide her with the needed surgeries. We were able to connect her to, doctors that could do the dental work that she needed. We were able to source the dentures that she was required. And putting it all together, she's now out there. She's an advocate. She wants to be a nurse. I think the other really important thing also when it comes to not just the work that we do, but the work the other humanitarian organizations do, especially when it comes to the children, all these kids have known for the last 7 years or so has been cruelty, war, and violence. That's their main life narrative. And we have to start showing them something else to give them even a fighting chance to then be able to dream and have a sustainable future for themselves and be functioning members of society. They need to see something other than evil, and that is on us, all of us, to really try to provide for them.
Do you know, it's an unusual step for a journalist to take. We often feel that if we tell the story, we are somehow, helping in that regard. I read something where you said you felt like sometimes you were screaming into the dark.
Yeah, and I think that's not just my sentiment. I think it's echoed by a lot of my colleagues, especially those of us that spent, years covering Iraq and then covering Syria. And there does come a point, and there did come a point for me where just reporting the story, it wasn't enough because there is, let's face it, apathy out there, a certain level of apathy when it comes to these conflicts that have been going on and dragging on for so long. And the journalism is not resonating perhaps in the way that it should be. And we question ourselves a lot when it comes to that as well. But then at the same time, we were all witnessing this glaring problem of all of these children that were being injured whose parents didn't necessarily know how to navigate a very complicated medical system, oftentimes in a foreign country. And they were at a complete loss. And you go out, you tell the story, and sometimes a child can get assistance, but sometimes they can't. And we all have networks that we can plug into. So why not bring all of these different networks together under the umbrella of a nonprofit that can really, to a certain degree, just do the smallest thing that we possibly can, and that is to help the most vulnerable who are in need. Because at the end of the day, if we help them, we're actually helping all of us. And the idea for the nonprofit, for Inara, came about from a story I covered about a decade ago in Iraq of this young boy named Yusuf, who was 5 years old at the time, and he had had gasoline thrown on his face, set on fire while he was standing outside of his home in Baghdad. And his father had pounded the pavement looking for help for his little boy, couldn't find any, finally came into our CNN bureau in Baghdad. And this poor child's face was just a hardened mask of rivers of scar tissue. And back then, there was a lot of apathy towards the Iraq story, and a lot of us felt as if no one really cared. But when we did the story on CNN, the response was overwhelming. The boy, Yusuf, and his entire family ended up in the United States, ended up getting the surgeries that he needed, largely thanks to donations from CNN and the Burn organization that took on his case in Los Angeles. Fast forward to when he's 15, and I just saw him fairly recently. He doesn't remember the attack anymore, and he used to have very vivid memories of it. His first memories are of people being kind. And that's just, to me, such a clear example of how we can change these children's narratives, and that's what we need to keep doing. So he was sort of the inspiration for Inara, and then with the apathy around what was happening in Syria, it went from being an idea to something that I sort of almost viscerally needed to do to make a difference. Because yes, sometimes the journalism just isn't enough.
Arwa, thank you very much for your insight and for all of your work.
Thank you.